Cheating wife gets husband jailed. Then he sends a gift that makes her scream. The sound of the gavel striking the judge's bench was like the final nail in Kurt D'Angelo's coffin. $6,500 a month. Every month. Until your daughter turns 18. And if she goes to college, you'll cover those expenses too. Kurt's fingers clenched into fists beneath the polished wooden table. The courtroom smelled of old books and cheap cologne, and the overhead fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, like a warning siren that only he could hear. His ex-wife, Lily, sat just a few feet away, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the table as she listened to the judge with an air of self-satisfaction. She was dressed to impress, a tailored gray blazer, a silky blouse that probably cost more than his entire monthly grocery bill, and a smug smile that made his blood boil. It wasn't enough that she had cheated on him. It wasn't enough that she had been caught in the arms of one of her colleagues, whispering sweet nothings in the same voice she once used to tell him she loved him. No, she had to take everything. Their daughter, their home, and now, over half his monthly income. The judge continued reading the verdict, but Kurt had stopped listening. Regina, their 15-year-old daughter, sat beside him, her knuckles white as she gripped the armrest of her chair. She had made it clear that she wanted to live with her father, that she wanted nothing to do with her mother's new glamorous lifestyle or the carousel of men who came and went through her law firm. But the judge, the honorable judge, didn't care. Mr. D'Angelo, the judge droned, peering down at him with a patronizing expression. Do you understand the terms of this agreement? Kurt exhaled slowly, forcing himself to relax. He had learned, growing up in a rough Chicago neighborhood, that letting anger get the best of you never ended well. But right now, he wanted to flip this entire courtroom upside down. Instead, he met the judge's gaze and nodded. Crystal clear, Your Honor. He turned his head slightly and caught Lily's lawyer smirking, a young, cocky associate from her firm, with slick back hair and the confidence of someone who had never actually been punched in the face before. The kind of guy who thought he was untouchable. Lily's attorney leaned in and whispered something to her, and she let out a quiet chuckle, shaking her head as if Kurt wasn't even worth discussing. They thought they had won. They thought they had him on his knees. Kurt D'Angelo had taken hits before, plenty of them, from life, from the streets, from his past. But there was one thing nobody seemed to understand about him. He never stayed down. The plan begins. By the time court adjourned, Kurt had already started formulating his plan. He stood, rolling his shoulders back, stretching out the tension that had coiled in his muscles. Lily made a show of ignoring him as she gathered her things, whispering to her lawyer like they were discussing weekend brunch plans. Kurt turned to Regina, placing a hand on her shoulder. You okay, kiddo? She looked up at him, her deep brown eyes filled with frustration. It's not fair, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mom's a liar, and they just let her win. He nodded, his jaw tightening. Yeah, I know. Lily turned then, her expression the perfect blend of fake sympathy and triumph. Regina, sweetheart, she said, reaching out for their daughter. We should get going. Regina recoiled slightly, stepping closer to Kurt. Lily's eyes darkened for a split second before she forced a patient smile. We'll talk more at home. Kurt exhaled, his mind racing. He had 30 days before the first spousal support payment was due. 30 days to make sure Lily would regret every single dollar she took from him. She wanted his money? Fine, she would get it. But not the way she expected. Lily's scream echoed through the marble-floored foyer, bouncing off the walls of the house she had fought so hard to keep. Her manicured fingers clutched the letter, knuckles white as she reread each sentence. Her mind raced, disbelief and panic clawing at her throat. This had to be a joke, a bluff. But the cold, sinking feeling in her gut told her otherwise. Her breath hitched as she grabbed her phone, fingers trembling while she dialed her lawyer, Stephen. The phone barely rang once before he picked up. Lily? What is it? Kurt. She spat his name like poison. He's screwing with me from jail. He sent me a letter. He's threatening to stop paying the mortgage, cancel my insurance, and she hesitated, eyes darting to the unopened mail sitting on the entryway table. A thick, official-looking envelope from the bank sat on top. Dread curdled in her stomach. And what? Stephen pressed. Lily swallowed hard, snatching up the envelope and ripping it open. Her eyes darted over the words, her vision blurring as she reached the part that made her stomach drop. Notice of foreclosure proceedings. The letter slipped from her fingers, fluttering to the floor like the last leaf of autumn before the cold bite of winter. Steve in my house. Her voice cracked. He actually did it. He stopped paying. Silence on the other end. Then a sigh. Lily, I told you to play this smarter, Stephen said, his voice lined with frustration. You push him too far. He's always been the kind of guy to strike back hard. You should have known better. Are you blaming me for this? She snapped. No, but you underestimated him. And now, we have to clean up the mess. You can't afford to lose that house, not after the image you've built at the firm. If the partners find out you're broke, it'll destroy your credibility. Lily pressed her fingers to her temples, feeling a headache coming on. So what do we do? First, we fight the foreclosure. I'll talk to the bank, see if we can delay things. But you need a backup plan. Lily exhaled sharply. Like what? Stephen hesitated. You might need to sell the house before they take it from you. It'll look better than having it repossessed. Sell it. Her voice rose in outrage. I fought for this damn house in the divorce. I am not letting him win. You should be more worried about the IRS, Stephen muttered. Lily's blood ran cold. What do you mean? You said he sent something to your boss, right? If he has proof of anything shady with the firm's finances, or your own, it could get bad. If the IRS sniffs around, they won't just be looking at him. Lily felt like the floor was tilting beneath her. She staggered to the kitchen, poured herself a glass of wine with shaking hands, and downed it in one go. No, this is fixable. I just need to get him to stop. He's in jail. He can't do much from there. Lily, Stephen said, voice low, you don't understand. Kurt has connections. She frowned. What kind of connections? The kind that don't need a law degree to ruin you. The kind that don't play by courtroom rules. For the first time since the divorce, real fear gripped her. She had always seen Kurt as a rough-around-the-edges businessman. Smart, sure, a survivor. But she had assumed that once she got the court on her side, once she had the law backing her, he would be powerless. She was wrong. And now, she had no idea how far he was willing to go. Meanwhile, in Cook County Jail, Kurt sat on the edge of his cot, stretching out his arms as he listened to the faint hum of voices beyond his cell. The infirmary visit had done him good. His bruises were healing, and his mind had never been sharper. He wasn't just sitting in jail. He was strategizing. A low chuckle drew his attention. Across the cell, Ringer leaned against the bars, smirking, word spreading, Texas. People are talking about you. Kurt smirked. Good or bad? Depends on who you ask. The guards hate you. The inmates respect you. Me? I'm just enjoying the show. Kurt nodded, cracking his knuckles. Lily thinks she's won, but she hasn't even begun to lose yet. Ringer tilted his head. What's next? Kurt leaned forward, his voice a low, controlled growl. I sent her a warning shot. Now I let her squirm. She'll try to fight the foreclosure. She'll panic when the money dries up. She'll scramble when she realizes her cushy job isn't so secure anymore. And when she's at her lowest, when she thinks she's barely surviving. He smiled. I'll send her the final gift. Ringer whistled. Damn, remind me never to cross you. Kurt just grinned, his blue eyes glinting with something dangerous. Lily had thought she could betray him, humiliate him, and strip him of everything he loved. She had forgotten one simple rule. Never mess with a man who has nothing left to lose. Kurt D'Angelo sat in the courtroom, his fingers laced together, expression unreadable. He had been through enough battles in life to know that court wasn't about truth or justice. It was about power. And today, The system was determined to crush him under its heel. Across the aisle, Lily sat with her lawyer, a smug smirk on her perfectly painted lips. She had already won the divorce, taken his daughter, and drained his bank account. Now, she was here to make sure he suffered just a little more. The judge, a gray-haired man with weary eyes and an air of unchallenged authority, cleared his throat. Mr. D'Angelo, it has come to my attention that your recent spousal support payment was made entirely in coins. Is that correct? Kurt leaned back, his voice calm. That's correct, Your Honor. I followed the court's ruling. I paid exactly what was ordered. Lily's lawyer, a tall man with a permanent look of condescension, stood. Your Honor, the way he paid was nothing short of harassment. My client had to spend hours cleaning up that mess, and the weight of the coins caused damage to her floors. Kurt's lawyer, a sharp-witted man named O'Malley, adjusted his tie and stood. Your Honor, with all due respect, U.S. currency is legal tender for all debts. My client's method of payment may have been inconvenient, but it was not illegal. The judge frowned. Mr. D'Angelo, why pay this way? Kurt smirked. It's money, isn't it? A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom. The judge wasn't amused. Lily's lawyer pounced. Furthermore, Your Honor, my client has yet to receive any child support payments. Mr. D'Angelo has been willfully neglecting his obligations. Kurt's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent. He knew what was coming next. O'Malley gave a slow, deliberate nod. Actually, Your Honor, the child support has been deposited directly into Miss Regina D'Angelo's personal account, which she has full access to. If you'd like confirmation, she's present in the courtroom. The judge turned his gaze toward Regina. Sitting in the front row, she met his eyes without flinching. Is this true? He asked. Regina nodded. Yes, sir. My dad made sure I got everything I needed. Lily's lawyer faltered, his confidence slipping. That wasn't the response he had been expecting. Kurt finally turned to Lily, meeting her cold stare. You thought I'd be stupid enough to let you control the money? Think again. For the first time, Lily's smirk disappeared. O'Malley pressed forward. We also have proof of continued mortgage and insurance payments, as required by the divorce ruling. Mr. D'Angelo has not failed in his responsibilities. The judge hesitated. Things weren't going as smoothly as he had planned. Lily's lawyer quickly regrouped. Regardless, Your Honor, paying in small coins is clearly an act of defiance and disrespect to this court. My client simply requests that future payments be made via check. Kurt was about to respond, but O'Malley was faster. Your Honor, I have a question. The judge, now visibly irritated, sighed. Go on. O'Malley's lips curled into a slow smile. Are the Chicago police part of the legal system? The judge blinked. Yes, of course. O'Malley stepped closer. Then if Mr. D'Angelo were to have his car impounded by the Chicago Police Department, could he retrieve it with a personal check? The courtroom fell silent. The judge shifted uncomfortably. No, he would need to pay in cash or with a credit card. O'Malley's smile widened. So let me get this straight. If the police, who are part of the legal system, won't accept a check, why should my client be required to pay spousal support with one? A murmur spread through the spectators. The judge's face darkened. He had been backed into a corner, and he knew it. Because this is my courtroom, the judge snapped, and I make the rules. Kurt exhaled slowly. There it was, the truth. This wasn't about justice. This was about power. The judge was protecting Lily, plain and simple. Kurt rose to his feet, his patience gone. You're not upholding the law. You're just bending over for my wife's law firm. What? Are you sleeping with her too? The courtroom gasped. Lily's face turned white. The judge's eyes flared with fury. Mr. D'Angelo, you are in contempt of court. I sentence you to 6 months in Cook County Jail unless you apologize and agree to my ruling. Kurt locked eyes with him. He could back down now, swallow his pride, and walk out with his freedom. Or he could make sure everyone knew exactly what kind of judge they were dealing with. He gave the judge a slow, defiant smile. You can take your court and shove it. The judge's face turned red. "Bailiff, take him away." As the guards grabbed his arms, he turned to Lily. She was staring at him, victorious. She thought she had won. Kurt grinned, not even close. As they led him out of the courtroom, he whispered over his shoulder, "Good luck paying your bills, sweetheart." Lily frowned, and for the first time that day, she felt a sliver of unease. Lily Carmichael D'Angelo stood in the center of her immaculate living room, staring down at the elegantly wrapped box that had just arrived at her doorstep. The gold ribbon shimmered under the warm glow of the chandelier, but something about it felt ominous. Her perfectly manicured fingers hesitated over the lid. Kurt, it had to be him. Even from jail, he was trying to get under her skin. But she had won. He was rotting in a cell while she enjoyed the spoils of their divorce. Still, curiosity gnawed at her. With a sharp tug, she loosened the bow and lifted the lid. Inside, resting atop black silk lining, was a single white envelope. The sight of it sent a chill skittering down her spine. Slowly, she unfolded the letter. "Dear Lily, you took my money, my daughter, and my freedom. But you forgot one thing I never lose. Look around, sweetheart. See that mortgage? I stopped paying it. You wanted luxury? Enjoy the foreclosure notice arriving next week. Remember that fancy health insurance? Canceled. Hope you saved up for those doctor visits. And as for your law firm, well, let's just say your boss might not appreciate the evidence I sent him about your office activities. But don't worry, you won't be completely alone. Your old friend, the IRS, will be in touch soon. Turns out, hiding assets in divorce proceedings is a federal offense. Have fun explaining that. See you around, love." Kurt. Lily's fingers trembled as she clutched the letter, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "No, no, no," she whispered, shaking her head. She darted to the kitchen, grabbing her phone with a force that nearly knocked over her overpriced imported vase. She scrolled to her bank's app, her nails tapping frantically against the screen. Account balance, $642.13. Her stomach lurched. Where was the money? The alimony, the child support, the mortgage payments? She refreshed the screen, as if sheer desperation could will the numbers to change. Nothing. A sense of dread curled in her gut. She switched apps, dialing her lawyer. "Lily," he answered, his tone neutral. "Tom, something's wrong. My account, my mortgage, I think, Kurt." "I was about to call you," Tom interrupted, his voice tight. "We have a problem." Lily's throat tightened. "A problem?" "The managing partners received a file this morning," he continued. "It contains, well, explicit evidence of your relationships with several members of the firm, including myself." Lily's blood ran cold. "We're looking at potential ethics violations. I'm being removed from my cases pending an internal review. And you, I don't know how you did it, but you made a lot of enemies here, Lily. They're talking about termination." Her vision blurred. "Termination? But you said—" "It doesn't matter what I said." Tom cut her off. "You should have been smarter." The line went dead. Lily's grip slackened, and the phone slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the marble floor. The sound barely registered. This couldn't be happening. Kurt was supposed to be rotting in jail, powerless. How had he done this? She turned back to the letter in the gift box, her eyes darting over the words again, searching for some sign, some loophole. Then she noticed something she hadn't before, a final line, written in ink so faint she had to hold it under the kitchen light to read it. "Check your mail, darling. There's more." Her pulse pounded in her ears as she bolted to the front door, wrenching it open. The afternoon sun was blinding, but she didn't care. She sprinted to the mailbox, yanking it open with such force that the metal door nearly bent backward. Inside, among the usual bills and junk mail, was a thick, official-looking envelope from the Internal Revenue Service. Her knees nearly buckled. With shaking hands, she tore it open. The first line of the letter sent ice through her veins. Notice of audit, potential tax fraud investigation. Lily let out a strangled gasp. Her carefully constructed world, The one she had fought for, schemed for, cheated for, was crumbling. She barely noticed the concerned neighbor peering from across the street. She didn't care. The only thought pounding through her mind was Kurt did this. And she had no idea what else was coming. The night in Cook County Jail was like every other, thick with the stench of sweat, despair, and unspoken threats. The overhead fluorescent lights buzzed like dying insects, flickering just enough to keep the tension in the air alive. Kurt D'Angelo lay on his metal cot, hands behind his head, staring at the cracked ceiling above. He wasn't asleep. He never slept deeply in a place like this. He had been inside for 2 weeks now, biding his time, planning his next move. Lily thought she had one. That smug smirk in the courtroom, the way she taunted him with her victory, thinking the system had crushed him. She had no idea what was coming. But first, he had to survive. The warning. Randall Ringer Turner, his old friend from the streets, had given him the heads up earlier that day. Tex, Ringer had said in a low voice, using Kurt's old nickname. Word is some of the COs are getting paid off to make your life hell. You pissed off the wrong people. Kurt didn't need to ask who. Lily's law firm had deep pockets and plenty of connections. It wasn't just about keeping him locked up. It was about making sure he left here in pieces. They making a move tonight? Kurt asked, voice calm even. Ringer hesitated. I heard 6 of them. Inmates. Plus maybe 2 guards. You know what that means. It meant he wasn't just in for a beating. They were going to send a message, one written in blood. Kurt cracked his knuckles. La Chincon. The setup. Midnight. The cell block was quiet except for the occasional cough or the distant echo of boots against the concrete floor. The guards had done their rounds, and now the real game was about to begin. A sudden buzz, then the metallic groan of the cell door sliding open. That wasn't supposed to happen. Kurt sat up slowly, his muscles coiled like a spring. 6 figures entered the cell. Large, hulking shadows, their faces twisted in anticipation. At the door, 2 guards stood watch, smirking. Bought men. The leader, a shaved-headed brute with a scar running from his temple to his jaw, cracked his neck. Heard you've been talking tough in court. Texas, his voice was gravel and menace. Time to see if you're still tough when you're bleeding out. The others chuckled. One of them, a wiry guy with tattoos creeping up his neck, flipped a shank between his fingers. Kurt stayed seated on his cot, rubbing his jaw as if considering his options. 6 on 1, he asked, his tone almost amused. Didn't think lawyers played fair, but damn. Scarface sneered. You think this is a joke? Kurt tilted his head. No, but I do think you're about to regret this. The fight. The first punch came fast, Scarface lunging forward with a wild swing. But Kurt had spent years fighting in back alleys and bar brawls. He dodged, grabbing Scarface's wrist and twisting it with a sharp crack. The man screamed as bones snapped. Chaos erupted. The wiry guy slashed with his shank, but Kurt kicked him in the gut, sending him sprawling into the metal toilet. Another man charged, but Kurt used his momentum, pivoting and slamming his elbow into the guy's throat. He gagged, stumbling back. A second later, Kurt felt a sharp sting in his side. The blade. He gritted his teeth as warmth spread across his ribs, but pain was just a distraction. He grabbed the shank-wielding man by the wrist, twisting until he heard the satisfying pop of a dislocated joint. The blade clattered to the floor, and Kurt drove his knee into the man's face. Blood sprayed against the wall. Scarface, despite his broken wrist, lunged again, desperate. Kurt ducked and drove his fist into the man's gut, then followed with an uppercut so hard it lifted him off his feet. One left. The last attacker hesitated, seeing the carnage. Then he turned and ran. The guards, no longer smirking, stepped forward, but before they could react, Ringer and 2 of his crew appeared outside the cell. Y'all didn't see nothing, Ringer growled at the guards. For a moment, it was a standoff. Then, one of the guards muttered a curse and turned away. The other followed. Bought men, but cowards all the same. Kurt wiped the blood from his lip, breathing hard. This wasn't just a warning. This was war. The message. The next morning, word spread fast. Everyone knew what had happened. Kurt D'Angelo wasn't just some rich real estate guy with a grudge. He was a man you didn't cross. When the nurse in the infirmary stitched him up, she shook her head. You really don't know when to quit, do you? Kurt just smiled. Lily had sent men to break him, but all she'd done was remind him of who he really was. And now? Now it was her turn to bleed. The fluorescent light above flickered as Kurt D'Angelo blinked awake, his head throbbing like a war drum. The sterile smell of antiseptic filled his nostrils, and the sharp pain in his ribs reminded him exactly where he was, the infirmary of Cook County Jail. He gritted his teeth. They'd jumped him. 6 men, handpicked and sent in by the guards, had dragged him into a brutal beatdown. He didn't remember much past the first few punches, just the taste of blood and the dull realization that this wasn't just about prison hierarchy. Someone on the outside had pulled the strings. Lily. The thought alone made his hands clench into fists, though even that small movement sent searing pain through his muscles. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. A soft rustling near the doorway made him turn his head. A nurse stood beside his bed, her hazel eyes filled with something Kurt hadn't seen in weeks: kindness. You're awake, she said softly. I was starting to wonder if you were planning on staying unconscious forever. Kurt tried to smirk, but winced instead. Figured I'd take a little vacation. Jail's been stressful. She gave a small laugh, but it faded quickly. You were out for almost a full day. Broken ribs, fractured wrist, concussion. You're lucky to be alive. He grunted. Lucky isn't the word I'd use. She hesitated, then leaned in slightly. Listen, I don't know what you did to land yourself in here, but I can tell when someone's been set up. That wasn't just a prison fight. That was a message. Kurt met her gaze. She was smart. Too smart to work in a place like this. Do me a favor, he said, voice low. Can you get a message to someone? She hesitated, glancing toward the door. Depends. He exhaled sharply, shifting in his bed. I need to see Randall Turner. She studied him for a moment, then nodded. I'll see what I can do. The next morning, Randall Ringer Turner walked into the infirmary, his sharp eyes scanning Kurt's injuries before whistling low. Damn, Texas. They really did a number on you. Kurt forced himself upright, ignoring the fire in his ribs. Yeah, well, it takes 6 cowards to bring me down. Ringer chuckled, but then got serious. So what's the plan? Kurt's mind had been spinning all night, forming and refining the next move in his game of chess. This wasn't just a random attack, he said. Somebody's trying to keep me down. Lily, Ringer guessed. Kurt nodded. Her, and whoever's backing her. The judge? Maybe. Someone at her firm? Definitely. But here's the thing. His lips curled into a slow, dangerous smile. They made a mistake. Ringer leaned in. Yeah. They didn't kill me. Ringer let out a dark chuckle. So what's the next move, Tex? Kurt took a breath, letting the anger settle into something colder, sharper. I need the names of the 6 guys who jumped me. Not their nicknames, their real names. Ringer raised an eyebrow. Why? Kurt's grin was razor sharp. Because when I'm done, they'll wish they never laid a hand on me. Ringer smirked. Damn, I miss this side of you. Kurt's eyes darkened. You ain't seen nothing yet. Meanwhile, across town, Lily sat in her sleek, modern office, sipping a glass of expensive red wine. The scent of victory was intoxicating. Kurt was out of the way, locked up, beaten down, and soon, he'd be nothing more than a memory. She had everything. The house, the money, the connections. Or so she thought. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She frowned, hesitated, then answered. Hello. A deep, familiar voice hummed through the receiver. Hope you enjoyed my little gift, sweetheart. The glass of wine slipped from her fingers, shattering onto the marble floor. A dim fluorescent light flickered above as Kurt D'Angelo sat on the stiff, creaking cot of his jail cell, muscles aching from the beating he'd taken. The sterile smell of bleach mixed with the sweat and grime of the inmates around him. His ribs throbbed, his lip was split, and there was dried blood on his temple from where one of the guards had accidentally let an elbow connect. But none of that mattered, because Kurt wasn't broken. No, he was waiting. Across from him, Randall Ringer Turner leaned against the cold concrete wall, arms crossed. Ringer had been a street hustler before landing in here, but unlike most, he had a mind for strategy. A man who knew how to survive. And right now, he was studying Kurt, eyes narrowed. "Damn, Tex," Ringer said, shaking his head. "You look like hell." Kurt wiped the dried blood from his chin and grinned, ignoring the pain that shot through his face. "Yeah, well, 6 guys against 1 isn't exactly fair." "Fair?" Ringer let out a bitter chuckle. "This place ain't built on fair." Kurt knew that all too well. The guards had set him up, thrown him into a room with 6 inmates who were looking to prove a point. Maybe they'd been bribed. Maybe they just didn't like the way he'd mouthed off to the judge. Either way, Kurt had taken his licks. But he wasn't just going to take it and move on. No, this was the moment he'd been waiting for. He leaned forward, voice low. "I need names, Ringer. The real ones, not just street names." Ringer rubbed his chin, hesitating. "You sure you want to go down that road?" Kurt's eyes darkened. "I don't have a choice." For a long moment, Ringer studied him, weighing his options. Finally, he exhaled sharply. "All right, I'll get you the names." Kurt nodded. That was step 1, because once he had those names, the next part of his plan could begin. Meanwhile, miles away, in a luxurious home that had once been theirs, Lily poured herself a glass of wine and stretched out on the white leather couch. She felt untouchable. Kurt was locked up. Regina was legally in her custody. The courts had sided with her at every turn. She had won. The only thing that annoyed her was the armored truck incident. It had embarrassed her, made her the talk of the neighborhood for weeks. People had laughed behind her back, whispering about how her husband had paid her in bags of pennies. That still burned, but it didn't matter. She had gone to court, and Kurt had been punished for his defiance. He'll rot in there, she thought, sipping her wine. Just then, her phone vibrated. She picked it up and frowned. It was an email from her law firm, marked urgent. As she read the first few lines, the glass slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor. Her boss had received an anonymous package, photos, emails, proof of her affairs with multiple partners at the firm. A scandal like this could ruin her. No, this isn't happening. A second email arrived, this one from her mortgage lender. The payment was overdue. That's impossible. Kurt is supposed to. Her breath hitched. She had been so focused on punishing him that she hadn't considered what would happen if he stopped playing by the rules. Then, a third notification, this one from an unknown sender. "Check your mailbox." Her hands trembled as she walked to the front door. The evening air was crisp, but she barely noticed as she retrieved the single, unmarked package sitting inside. She carried it back to the kitchen, heart pounding, and tore it open. Inside was a simple white envelope. She unfolded the letter, her eyes scanning the words. "Dear Lily, you took my money, my daughter, and my freedom. But you forgot one thing I never lose." She gripped the edge of the counter, her nails digging into the marble. "Look around, sweetheart. See that mortgage? I stopped paying it. You wanted luxury? Enjoy the foreclosure notice arriving next week." Lily's chest tightened. "Remember that fancy health insurance? Canceled. Hope you saved up for those doctor visits. And as for your law firm, well, let's just say your boss might not appreciate the evidence I send him about your office activities." Her blood ran cold. "But don't worry. You won't be completely alone. Your old friend, the IRS, will be in touch soon. Turns out, hiding assets in divorce proceedings is a federal offense. Have fun explaining that. See you around, love." Kurt, the letter fell from her hands. And then she screamed. Back in jail, Kurt lay on his cot, staring at the ceiling, ignoring the soreness in his ribs. He didn't need to be outside to bring Lily's world crashing down. He had planned for this. And this was only the beginning. Betrayed, but not broken. My journey to freedom. I used to believe that love was enough. That if you poured your heart into something, gave it everything you had, it would never fall apart. I built my life on that belief. I built my family on it. I met my wife 6 years ago, and from the moment she walked into my life, everything changed. She had this effortless beauty, a smile that could make a man forget his past, and a presence that made the world feel lighter. She wasn't just someone I loved, she was my home. When I married her, I didn't just take vows, I took on a responsibility. She had 2 boys from a previous relationship, and though they weren't my blood, I never saw them as anything but mine. From the first time I tucked them into bed, from the first scraped knee I cleaned, from the first time they called me dad without hesitation, I knew I was all in. Our life wasn't perfect, but it was ours. I worked hard to give them stability, a place where they would always feel safe. I took pride in the little things, waking up early to make them breakfast, staying up late to help with school projects, planning surprise trips just to see their eyes light up. And for a long time, I thought she appreciated it. We had our routines, our traditions. Friday nights were movie nights, always ending with the kids asleep on the couch, popcorn spilled between the cushions. Sundays were for slow mornings, pancakes, and the sound of cartoons in the background. I thought those moments were enough. But looking back, I can see the cracks, tiny fractures that I ignore because I wanted so badly to believe in the life we had built. It started with small things, things that didn't seem to matter at the time. She began going out more, needing me time, as she called it. I never questioned it. I wanted her to be happy. If she needed a break from the demands of motherhood and marriage, I understood. I supported her. But then the nights out became more frequent. At first, it was once a month, then once a week, then twice. Then suddenly, I was tucking the kids in alone more often than not. She would come home late, slipping into bed without a word, the scent of perfume and something unfamiliar lingering in the air. I'd lie awake beside her, staring at the ceiling, a knot tightening in my stomach. Something was changing. I could feel it, but I wasn't ready to admit it. The first time she came home late, I told myself it was nothing. I had been dozing off on the couch, a muted television flickering blue light across the living room walls. My phone lay on the armrest beside me, her last text still open. Running late. Love you. I trusted her. When I heard the soft rattle of keys at the front door, I sat up. The clock on the wall read 1:37 a.m. She stepped inside, wobbling slightly on her heels, her hair a little too messy for someone who had just been out for drinks. The faint scent of alcohol clung to her clothes, but there was something else beneath it, a sharp, musky cologne that didn't belong to me. She smiled, but it was tired, distant. Hey, she murmured, kicking off her shoes. You waited up? I nodded. You okay? Yeah. She yawned, stretching her arms over her head. Had a few drinks. I'm exhausted. That was it. No details. No stories about the night. Just an excuse and the slow retreat to our bedroom. I wanted to ask more. Who was there? What did you do? Why didn't you call? But I swallowed the questions, convincing myself I was being paranoid. The second time, it was worse. That night, she didn't text. I stare at my phone for hours, refreshing our messages, checking the time. Midnight passed, then 1, then 2. I called. It rang. No answer. I texted, Hey, are you okay? No response. The anxiety was suffocating, a slow tightening in my chest. I paced the living room, my mind spinning through scenarios, an accident, a dead phone, a forgotten promise. Then, at 2:43 a.m., the door creaked open. She stepped inside, her eyeliner smudged, her dress wrinkled in a way that didn't make sense. She didn't see me right away. She leaned against the wall, sighing deeply before peeling off her jacket. Where were you? My voice was sharper than I intended. She flinched, then looked up, her expression shifting. First surprise, then irritation. I told you, out with the girls. You didn't text back. I called you. Her lips parted, then closed again. A beat of silence. My phone died. I stared at her, searching for something, guilt, remorse, even frustration. But she just stood there, running a hand through her tangled hair. I was worried. I admitted, my voice softer now. She sighed and rolled her eyes. God, I'm not a teenager. Do I need to check in with you every 5 minutes? The words stung more than I expected. No, I said quietly. Just enough so I don't think something happened to you. She exhaled sharply and waved a hand dismissively. I'm tired. Can we talk about this tomorrow? She walked past me, up the stairs, leaving behind a trail of perfume and unanswered questions. I didn't sleep that night. The third time, I knew something was wrong. By then, it was a pattern. The late nights, the vague explanations, the growing distance between us like a widening crack in glass. But that night, I saw it. The confirmation I had been dreading. She came home at 3 a.m., stumbling through the doorway, a breathless laugh escaping her lips before she saw me waiting. Then guilt. It flickered across her face so quickly I almost missed it. The way her smile faltered. The way her hand instinctively touched her lips as if wiping something away. And there was again that scent, the foreign cologne, clinging to her like a secret she couldn't wash off. She knew I noticed. Her expression shifted, a flicker of calculation. Then she dropped her purse on the counter and rubbed her temples. God, I drank way too much. I didn't say anything. I just watched her. She avoided my gaze, busying herself by tossing her keys into the bowl, unzipping her boots. Did you have fun? I finally asked. She hesitated. Yeah, a beat. It was just nice to get out. She wouldn't meet my eyes. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to pretend this was just another night out, another harmless escape from the monotony of marriage and motherhood. But the truth was right in front of me, woven into the fabric of her being, the way she smelled, the way she looked at me like a stranger in our own home. I felt in my bones. Something was slipping away. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I could catch it. I sat in the quiet of my living room, the glow of the television flickering against the walls, though I wasn't really watching. The house felt different lately. Emptier, colder, like something vital had been drained from it. My wife had gone out again. I didn't even ask where. Maybe I already knew the answer. The boys were asleep upstairs, their soft breathing a rhythmic reminder of why I couldn't let my thoughts spiral too deep. I was their rock, their protector. I couldn't afford to unravel, no matter how much my gut twisted with suspicion. After what felt like hours of wrestling with my thoughts, I reached for my phone and dialed my parents. My father picked up on the second ring. Son. His voice was groggy, laced with sleep. I checked the clock, 11:47 p.m. I hadn't even realized how late it was. Sorry, Dad. Did I wake you? There was a pause, then the rustling of sheets as he sat up. Doesn't matter. What's wrong? I hesitated. How do you even begin to say something like this? I think something's going on with her. I finally admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Silence. Then a slow, measured exhale. She's been going out a lot. It wasn't a question. Yeah. And you're not invited. Right. Another pause. And she's not giving you answers. Nope. Dad sighed. And in that moment, I could picture him rubbing his temples, processing my words like a puzzle he already knew the solution to but wished he didn't. Son, I don't want to jump to conclusions, but I know. My voice came out hoarse. I don't want to either. There was a creak on the line, the familiar sound of my father shifting in his old recliner. A married woman shouldn't be out till all hours of the night, leaving her husband at home with the kids. His tone was firm, but not unkind. It's not right. You know it. She knows it. I swallowed hard, staring at the blank TV screen. I just don't understand. Things were fine. We were happy. Were you? The question landed like a blow to the chest. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to tell him how much I loved her, how much I loved the boys, how I had built a life with them that I never thought I'd have. But deep down, I knew what he was asking. Had I been ignoring the signs? Had she already checked out, while I clung to the version of us that only existed in my head? I thought so. I admitted, the words bitter on my tongue. There was a rustling sound on the other end, then a softer voice. Sweetheart, My mother had taken a phone. I closed my eyes. Hey, Mom. Oh, honey. I could hear the worry laced in her voice, that unspoken instinct mothers have when they know their child is hurting. What's going on? I told her everything. The late nights, the evasive answers, the way my wife had started pulling away, like she was there, but not really present. She doesn't talk to me the same way anymore, I confessed. She's distracted, like her mind is somewhere else. Mom hummed thoughtfully. And what do you think that somewhere else is? I knew what she meant, but I couldn't say it. Not yet. I don't know. Well, you need to find out. Her voice was gentle but firm. You can't live in uncertainty, sweetheart. It'll eat you alive. A lump formed in my throat. I thought about my wife's smile, how it used to be mine, how it used to be full of love when she looked at me. Now it was different, fainter, forced, like I was a habit, not a choice. I don't want to believe the worst, I admitted. Of course you don't, she said softly. No one ever does. Dad's voice cut back in. Listen to me, son. If she respects you, she'll understand your concerns. If she gets defensive, you let the thought trail off, letting me fill in the blanks. I just don't know how to bring it up without it turning into a fight. Then let her start the fight, he said, and watch how she fights it. That night, I waited for her. I sat on the couch, watching the minutes tick by, my heart pounding with an anxious rhythm I couldn't control. She came home around 1:30 a.m. I heard the car door shut, the rustle of keys, the way she hesitated just a moment before stepping inside. When she saw me awake, her eyes flickered with something. Guilt? Annoyance? I couldn't tell. You're up? She asked, feigning nonchalance as she slipped off her heels. Yeah, I said, keeping my voice even. Where were you? She froze for half a second. Not long, but long enough. Then she shrugged. Out with the girls. I told you. She didn't meet my eyes. I studied her carefully, the way she busied herself with her purse, how she pulled out her phone and scrolled like she needed to fill the silence. Are you happy? I asked suddenly. That caught her off guard. She glanced at me, brows furrowing. What? Are you happy? I repeated, my voice quieter this time. With us? With me? For a fraction of a second, I saw it. The hesitation, the flicker of something she tried to mask. Then, she forced a smile. Of course I am. She leaned down, kissed my cheek, and whispered, I'm tired. Let's talk tomorrow. Then she walked upstairs, leaving me in the dim glow of the living room, my father's words ringing in my ears. Watch how she fights it. She didn't fight it at all. And somehow that felt worse. The doubt had festered for weeks, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. It had started as a whisper in my mind, then grew into a deafening roar I couldn't ignore. The late nights, the lies disguised as half-truths, the distance between us that felt like an uncrossable ocean. I needed answers. Hiring a private investigator felt like an admission of failure. It meant I no longer trusted my wife, the woman I had vowed to spend my life with, the woman whose sons I had raised as my own. But trust isn't blind. It's built on actions, and her actions had left me standing in the dark, fumbling for something solid to hold on to. The investigator's name was Daniel. He was a wiry man with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. When I met him in a quiet cafe, he spoke with the detached professionalism of someone who had done this 1,000 times. I'll find out what's going on, he said. You might not like the answer. I already didn't like the question. 3 days passed. 3 endless, restless days where I jumped every time my phone buzzed, my stomach twisted in knots I couldn't untangle. Then, finally, Daniel called. Meet me in my office, he said. I drove there in a daze, hands gripping the wheel too tightly. My heartbeat was a war drum in my chest. I already knew. Deep down, I had known for weeks. But knowing and seeing were two very different things. Daniel's office was small but orderly. A filing cabinet sat in the corner, neatly labeled, and a half-empty cup of coffee steamed on his desk. He didn't waste time. I have the footage, he said, handing me a flash drive. I stared at it, the small metal object suddenly unbearably heavy in my hand. She wasn't alone, he continued. Same man, 2 different nights. Same bar. They were close. The words settled in my bones like lead. Are you sure? My voice sounded foreign, as if it belonged to someone else. He nodded. I don't bring my clients speculation. Just facts. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to breathe. I appreciate your time, I said, slipping the flash drive into my pocket. Good luck, he replied, his voice tinged with something I couldn't quite place. Pity maybe, or experience. That night, I waited until my wife was asleep before I plugged the flash drive into my laptop. The screen flickered to life, the video file waiting like a loaded gun. I pressed play. At first, it was just grainy security footage, the muted glow of a dimly lit bar. Music played, though I couldn't hear it. People laughed, clinking glasses, lost in their own worlds. Then I saw her. My wife sat at the bar, wearing the dress I had complimented before she left that night. She was smiling, but not the smile she gave me. This was something else, something softer, more intimate. And then there was him. Tall, dark-haired, confident. He leaned into her, his hand resting too easily on the small of her back. She didn't pull away. She didn't hesitate. She just laughed, tilting her head in that way she used to when we first met. My breath caught. Then, as if the universe wanted to crush any lingering hope, he kissed her. It wasn't hesitant. It wasn't accidental. It was full of intent. And worse, she kissed back. The video blurred as my eyes stung, but I forced myself to watch. Because this was the moment my marriage ended. Not with an argument, not with a slammed door, but with a kiss in a dimly lit bar where she thought no one would see. I closed the laptop, my hand shaking. There it was. The truth laid bare. No more doubt, no more wondering. Just betrayal, cold and undeniable. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the dark screen. The house was silent, except for the sound of my own breathing. She was sleeping just down the hall, oblivious to the wreckage she had left behind. For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than confusion or pain. I felt clarity, and I knew exactly what I had to do. The house was silent except for the steady ticking of the clock on the living room wall. Each tick felt heavier than the last, like a hammer driving nails into the coffin of my marriage. My laptop sat open in front of me, the damning footage paused on a frame that would be burned into my mind forever. My wife, her lips pressed against another man's, her fingers tangled in his hair. I clenched my fists so hard my nails dug into my palms. The pain was a welcome distraction from the rage boiling beneath my skin. I wanted to scream, to flip the table, to throw something, anything to match the destruction inside me. But I didn't. I just sat there, staring at the frozen image, willing it to be something else, something innocent. It wasn't. Upstairs, I could hear the soft hum of the shower running. She was home now, washing away the scent of her betrayal. Did she even feel guilty? Did she think I was that blind, that trusting? I exhaled sharply, pushing the laptop shut. I needed to think. For years, I had built my life around this woman. I had helped raise her sons as if they were my own. I had sacrificed, compromised, and loved with everything I had. And this was what I got in return. The shower stopped. The pipes groaned as the water cut off. I heard the shuffle of feet, the faint creak of the bathroom door opening. A moment later, she emerged, wrapped in a towel, steam curling around her like mist. She smiled at me. Smiled. Hey, she said casually, rubbing the towel against her damp hair. You're still up? I swallowed the bitter taste in my mouth. How could she look me in the eye like that? How could she pretend everything was fine? Yeah, I said, my voice even. Couldn't sleep. She patted across the room and kissed my forehead, an automatic, thoughtless gesture. Her lips were soft, warm. I wanted to recoil, to wipe the touch away, but I forced myself to stay still. You should come to bed, she murmured, her voice laced with drowsiness. I watched her disappear into the bedroom, my stomach twisting into knots. This was it, the moment I had to decide. Did I confront her now? Did I demand the truth, throw the evidence in her face, watch her scramble for excuses? Or did I walk away, cut my losses, and leave her to the lies she had built? I stood, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me. My heart pounded so hard I could hear in my ears. I took one last look at the laptop, then at the darkened bedroom where she lay waiting, unaware that everything was about to change. I grabbed my suitcase from the hall closet. I packed in silence, folding clothes with a numb sort of precision. A shirt, a pair of jeans, socks. I didn't need much, just enough to get me through the next few days while I figured out what came next. I hesitated at the dresser where our wedding photo sat in a frame, our smiles frozen in time. I picked it up, my thumb brushing over her face. I remembered that day, the way she had looked at me, the way she had sworn forever. Forever had been a lie. I set the frame face down. With my bag slung over my shoulder, I walked to the boys' room. I cracked the door open just enough to see them sleeping, their faces peaceful, untouched by the storm brewing between their parents. My chest ached. They didn't deserve this. But I couldn't stay. Not for them. Not for her. Not for the hollow shell of a marriage that had already crumbled beneath my feet. I grabbed my car keys, and without a single word, without a single glance back, I walked out the door. The morning after I left, my phone vibrated incessantly. Messages poured in, each one more frantic than the last. "Where are you? Why did you leave? Please, talk to me." I didn't answer. I stared at the screen, feeling the weight of her words, but not the sincerity behind them. A woman who truly cared wouldn't have betrayed me in the first place. I sat at my parents' kitchen table, the smell of fresh coffee filling the air. My father sat across from me, arms crossed, watching me closely. He was a man of few words, but when he spoke, his words carried weight. "What's your next move?" he finally asked. My mother hovered nearby, her hands gripping a dish towel as if wringing it out could somehow wring the pain from my chest. "I'm calling a lawyer," I said. The words tasted bitter, but they were firm. My mother sighed. "Are you sure?" "Maybe." "There's no maybe," I interrupted. "I saw it. I saw her with him. There's nothing to save." She nodded, wiping her eyes before she turned to the sink. My father said nothing, but the slight nod of his head told me he approved. By noon, I was sitting in a sleek office across from a divorce attorney. He was a well-dressed man in his 40s, his suit pristine, his watch gleaming in the sunlight streaming through the window. He flipped through a legal pad, tapping his pen against the desk. "You have proof." I slid the flash drive across the desk. "All of it." He inserted it into his laptop, and the video played. I didn't need a look. I had already seen it enough times for it to be permanently seared into my mind. My wife, draped over another man, her fingers tracing patterns on his arm, the way they laughed, the way she kissed him like he was the only person in the world. The lawyer nodded. "This will help. Do you want to fight for custody of the kids?" The question made my stomach twist. "They're not mine biologically," I admitted, "but I raised them. I love them like they're my own." He exhaled slowly. "That complicates things, but we can argue for visitation rights at the very least." I rubbed my temples. "I just want to make this as easy as possible for them. We'll do everything we can." The papers were drawn up within days. It was a simple case, irreconcilable differences, proof of infidelity. My lawyer assured me that the court would favor me, especially with the evidence I had. Now, I just had to deliver the papers. I returned to the house on a quiet Thursday evening, just as the sun was setting. The sky burned orange and purple, the colors bleeding into one another like a slow-moving fire. I sat in my car for a long time, gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady my breath. The house we had built together stood in front of me, unchanged, but everything inside it had crumbled. I finally stepped out, walking toward the door with the envelope in hand. My footsteps felt heavier with each step. I knocked. The door swung open, and there she was. She looked startled at first, then relieved. "Oh my God, you're here." She reached for me, but I stepped back, holding up the envelope between us like a barrier. Her eyes flicked to it, and in an instant, her relief was replaced by understanding. "What is this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You know what it is." Her hands trembled as she took the papers. She flipped through them quickly, her breathing shallow. "No," she said, shaking her head. "No, we can talk about this. We can fix it." I let out a bitter laugh. "Fix it? You think this can be fixed?" Tears welled in her eyes. "I made a mistake." I clenched my jaw. "You made a choice." She reached for me again, desperate this time. "I love you. I swear I do." I took another step back. "Then why did you do it?" I asked. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Because there was no answer that could justify what she had done. No excuse that could erase what I had seen. Tears streamed down her face now. "Please." I exhaled slowly, shaking my head. "It's too late." I turned and walked away. She called after me, her voice breaking, but I didn't stop. I got into my car, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. As I drove away, I didn't look in the rearview mirror. There was nothing left to see. The morning I handed her the divorce papers, the air was heavy with a silence that felt unnatural. The kind of silence that isn't peaceful, but waiting, like the stillness before a thunderstorm. She was sitting at the kitchen table when I walked in, sipping her coffee absent-mindedly, scrolling on her phone. A normal morning for her, but not for me. I placed the envelope on the table between us. The sound was soft but sharp, like a blade sliding from its sheath. She glanced up, her eyes flickering to the papers, then back to my face. Confusion knitted her brow. Then realization. Then panic. "What is this?" she asked, though she already knew. I exhaled, steadying myself. "Divorce papers." Her fingers trembled as she reached for them, unfolding the pages like they might rearrange themselves into something different, something less final. "No," she whispered, barely audible. "No, we can talk about this. We can fix this." I shook my head, my voice steady but heavy with everything we had lost. "We're past that." She stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the tile. "You're just going to throw this away?" Her voice rose, hysteria creeping into the edges. "After everything we've built?" I should have been angry. I should have wanted to shout, to list every betrayal, every moment I'd spent lying awake, wondering who she was with and why I wasn't enough. But I wasn't angry. I was empty. "I didn't throw anything away," I said. "You did." Her breath hitched, and for a moment, just a moment, I saw the weight of it hit her. The realization that she had finally pushed too far, that this was not another argument she could smooth over with apologies or empty promises. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "It was a mistake," she said, voice breaking. "I made a mistake." I had spent weeks imagining this moment, thinking that maybe if she showed remorse, if she begged, I would feel something, anger, sorrow, a twisted satisfaction. But all I felt was the quiet certainty that this was the right decision. "You made a choice," I said. "Now, I'm making mine." She reached for me, her fingers brushing my arm, but I stepped back. "Please," she whispered, "don't do this." But I already had. I turned and walked toward the door, my footsteps echoing in the house that had once been my home. I didn't look back, not even when I heard her sob. Outside, the air was crisp, the sun breaking through the morning clouds, casting long golden streaks across the pavement. For the first time in a long time, I took a deep breath. And for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like I was drowning. I wasn't broken. I was free, blindsided by love, the betrayal that changed everything. Rick never believed in love at first sight. He always thought it was something reserved for fairy tales and Hollywood movies, the kind of thing that made good stories but never really happened in real life. At least, not to guys like him. At 27, he had his feet firmly planted in reality. He was practical, logical, and maybe a little too cautious when it came to love. Years of rejection had taught him not to expect too much. He wasn't the kind of guy women fell for at first glance. He wasn't particularly suave or charming, and his social skills leaned more toward awkward than effortless. He had learned to accept that. But then came her. The night they met, the air was thick with the scent of vanilla candles and spilled beer. It was one of those chaotic, overcrowded birthday parties where people packed into a friend's apartment like sardines, sipping cheap drinks and shouting over deafening music. Rick wasn't even supposed to be there. He had only come because his roommate insisted, and because, honestly, he had nothing better to do. And then, through the dim lighting and pulsing music, he saw Maya. She wasn't just beautiful. She was mesmerizing. Dark, wavy hair cascaded over her shoulders, framing a face that looked like it belonged on the cover of a magazine. Sharp cheekbones, full lips, eyes that sparkled even in the low light. But it wasn't just her looks. It was the way she moved, the way she laughed, the way her presence commanded the room without even trying. Rick had no chance. He wasn't the type to approach women like her. Women who looked like they already knew every guy in the room wanted them. He had spent too many nights nursing the sting of rejection to set himself up for another one. So, he did what he always did, kept to himself, stuck to his circle of friends, and admired from afar. But then, the impossible happened. She walked up to him. "You're Rick, right?" she said, her voice smooth, confident, with just a hint of amusement. Rick nearly choked on his drink. He wasn't sure what shocked him more, the fact that she knew his name or the fact that she was actually talking to him. Yeah, he managed, his brain scrambling for something remotely intelligent to say. "And you're Maya," she said with a smirk. "I've seen you around. You always look like you're overthinking something." That made him laugh. It was true. From that moment on, the night changed. He forgot about the overcrowded apartment, the bad music, and the sticky floor. They talked for hours, effortlessly slipping into a rhythm that felt natural, like they had known each other for years. She was witty, sharp, and had a way of making him feel like the most interesting man in the room. By the end of the night, Rick was smitten. Hopelessly. They started seeing each other, and everything about their relationship felt like it had been written in the stars. Maya was everything he had never dared to dream of. She made him feel wanted, desired, needed. For the first time in his life, he wasn't the guy chasing after someone. He was the one being chased. Then came the moment that sealed his fate. Maya was struggling financially. She had just graduated, was between jobs, and was barely scraping by. Rent was overdue. Bills were piling up. Her worried expressions, her frustrated sighs, it all made Rick's heart ache. So, he did what felt right. He stepped in. He covered her rent, bought her groceries, paid for their dates. It wasn't about money. It was about love. He wanted to take care of her, to prove that she could count on him, that he was more than just a fleeting romance. Maya never refused his help. If anything, she embraced it. Rick thought he was building a future, that this was love, selfless, unwavering, unconditional. But love had made him blind. And in the shadows of their perfect romance, something dark was lurking. Something that would shatter everything he believed about Maya, about love, and about himself. But for now, he was still dreaming, still believing, still completely, utterly unaware. Rick never considered himself the type to ignore red flags, but love had a way of painting even the worst warnings in soft, forgiving colors. When it came to Maya, he wasn't just in love, he was consumed. Every smile, every touch, every whispered "I love you" felt like a promise of forever. So when Andrea, Maya's best friend, started acting strangely, he brushed it off. At first, it was just small things, side glances, hesitant pauses in conversations. Andrea was always around, always watching, but never saying what was really on her mind. Rick thought she might be protective, maybe even a little jealous. After all, he was taking up most of Maya's time now. But then, one night, everything changed. It was a humid Friday evening, and Rick had just finished a long day at work. Maya was out with her colleagues, celebrating a promotion she hadn't actually earned. Her manager had taken pity on her after she nearly got fired. But she acted like she had climbed a mountain. Rick didn't argue. If it made her happy, he would let her have it. Andrea called unexpectedly, her voice unsteady. Hey, Rick, you at home? Yeah. What's up? A long pause. Then, finally, she spoke. I need to talk to you. It's about Maya. Rick's stomach twisted. He tried to laugh it off. You sound so serious. If this is about her spending habits, trust me, I know. It's not about that. Something in her tone made the hairs on his arms rise. Okay, want to meet somewhere? He asked. Yeah, there's a bar near my place. Just come alone, okay? Rick didn't know what he was walking into, but curiosity and unease led him there. Andrea was already sitting at a dimly lit booth when he arrived, fingers tracing the rim of her untouched drink. She looked different, tense, like she had been wrestling with something for a long time. Rick slid into the seat across from her. All right, what's going on? Andrea sighed, pushing her drink away. I don't even know where to start. How about from the beginning? She hesitated before leaning in slightly, her voice low. Rick, you're a good guy. Too good, maybe. And I don't want to be the one to hurt you. But I can't keep watching this and say nothing. He frowned. Watching what? She glanced around, as if making sure no one else could hear. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, Maya isn't who you think she is. Rick stiffened. A strange, ice-cold sensation crept up his spine. What does that mean? Andrea swallowed hard. I know you love her, and I know she says she loves you, but have you ever thought that maybe you're not the only one? His breath caught in his throat. Are you saying she's? I don't know for sure, Andrea cut in quickly, but I know how she is. I know how she talks about you when you're not around, and I know she has secrets. Rick's first instinct was to defend Maya. Secrets? Every couple has secrets. That doesn't mean she's unfaithful. But something about Andrea's expression told him this was more than just gossip. He forced a chuckle. Andrea, come on. If you have something real to tell me, just say it. Otherwise, this just sounds like paranoia. She stared at him for a long time, like she was debating whether he was even worth saving. Then, she reached in her bag, pulled out her phone, and tapped the screen a few times before sliding it across the table. Rick looked down. His heart stopped. It was a photo, blurry but unmistakable. Maya, in a dimly lit bar, laughing, her hand resting intimately on a man's arm. The man wasn't Rick. He stared at the image, his pulse hammering in his ears. Andrea watched his face carefully. That was taken last weekend. She told you she was at a spa with her cousin, didn't she? Rick clenched his jaw. Who is he? I don't know, but I know this isn't the first time. His head spun. This wasn't just some vague warning anymore. This was something real. Andrea exhaled sharply. Listen, I'm telling you because I think you deserve to know. But if you'd rather ignore it, that's on you. Rick remained silent. His fingers gripped the edge of the table, knuckles turning white. He felt sick. Andrea sighed. I'm sorry, Rick. I really am. She stood up, tossing a few bills onto the table. Just keep your eyes open, before it's too late. And with that, she was gone, leaving Rick alone with the cold, bitter truth. For the first time since meeting Maya, he wondered if their love story had been a lie all along. Rick sat at the tiny dining table in their apartment, staring at the latest wedding budget spreadsheet. The numbers glared back at him like a warning sign, flashing red, but Maya didn't seem to notice or care. She stood across from him, a dreamy smile on her face as she scrolled through floral arrangements on her phone. Rick, just look at these centerpieces. Aren't they perfect? She chirped, turning her screen toward him. The image showed towering bouquets of roses and orchids, white and gold accents dripping with elegance. The price tag, he knew without checking, was absurd. Rick exhaled, rubbing his temples. Maya, we need to talk about this. The wedding costs are piling up, and we're already stretched thin. I don't want to start our marriage in debt. Maya rolled her eyes, flopping onto the chair opposite him. Oh, come on, Rick. It's our wedding day. It has to be special. You don't get married to save money. You get married to create a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Rick's fingers curled around the edge of the table. He had been working extra hours, sacrificing nights out, skipping personal expenses just to keep up with their growing bills. Meanwhile, Maya, who had finally landed a job a few months ago, had spent every penny of her first few paychecks on dress fittings, bridal showers, and deposits for extravagant vendors. He had assumed, naively, that once she had a steady income, she would contribute more to their household expenses. Instead, he found himself covering rent, utilities, and groceries, while she poured every bit of her money into the wedding. Rick tried again, keeping his voice level. I just think we should focus on what really matters. A simple, intimate wedding could be just as beautiful. Maya groaned, leaning back dramatically. You don't get it. This is the one day I've dreamed of my whole life, Rick. And if we cut corners, I'll regret it forever. There was something in her tone that sent a chill through him. Something entitled, almost dismissive. Was this really just about the wedding? Or was it about the image, the show, the illusion of perfection? Rick sighed, deciding to drop it for now. All right, let's just be mindful, okay? Maya beamed, pressing a quick kiss to his cheek before going back to her phone. You worry too much. He wished he could take comfort in that. That night, Rick met up with his friend Mark at their usual bar, hoping for a distraction. But even as Mark talked about work and sports, Rick's mind kept circling back to the wedding, to Maya, to the feeling that something was slipping through his fingers. So, how's the groom-to-be? Mark finally asked, swirling his drink. Excited? Rick hesitated. Yeah, I guess. Mark's brows lifted. That was unconvincing. Rick exhaled, pushing his beer bottle in slow circles on the table. It's just, the wedding planning has been intense. And expensive. Mark let out a short laugh. Yeah, man. Weddings are a scam. My cousin dropped 50 grand on his, and his wife left him 2 years later. Complete waste. Rick flinched at the thought. That won't happen to us, he said quickly, but his own voice sounded uncertain. Mark studied him for a moment, then shrugged. I hope not. But if you already have doubts, maybe take a step back and ask yourself why. Rick didn't have an answer for that. A few days later, he was standing in the kitchen, waiting for coffee to brew, when his phone buzzed. It was Andrea. Andrea, hey, can we talk? Rick frowned. He and Andrea had never been particularly close, and she rarely texted him directly. Maya's best friend, her partner in crime, her confidant. If Andrea was reaching out, it had to be serious. Rick, sure. What's up? The dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. Finally, a message came through. Andrea, it's about Maya. There's something you need to know. Rick's stomach twisted. He didn't reply right away. His fingers hovered over the screen, his mind racing. Something felt wrong. And deep down, he knew. He wasn't going to like what Andrea had to say. The night air felt thick, pressing against Rick's skin as he gripped the steering wheel. Andrea's voice still echoed in his mind, urgent, panicked. You need to come now. She's at the hotel with him. At first, he hadn't wanted to believe it. Not Maya, not the woman he had loved, supported, and planned a future with. But Andrea had been insistent, her voice carrying an edge of both fury and sorrow. She had always been protective, but never like this. This time, she was desperate. The drive felt both too long and too short. Each mile brought him closer to a truth he wasn't ready for, yet a part of him already knew. He had ignored too many signs. Maya's sudden distance, the way she had clung to her phone lately, the way she dismissed his concerns about her ex, Alex, laughing them off as jealousy. Now, that jealousy had turned into something far worse. Rick pulled up to the hotel, his heart pounding in his chest. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a few scattered cars. The neon hotel sign flickered above him like an omen. Andrea was waiting just outside the entrance, arms crossed, her face tight with anger. She's in room 214, she said, barely above a whisper. Rick's hands clenched into fists. How long? His voice was hoarse. Andrea hesitated. Long enough. A bitter laugh escaped him. Long enough. 2 words that carried the weight of 1,000 betrayals. He stepped inside, his movements mechanical. The hallway smelled of cheap air freshener and something artificial, masking whatever secrets these walls had absorbed over the years. His footsteps were soundless against the carpet, but his heartbeat thundered in his ears. When he reached the door, he hesitated. His hand hovered over the handle. He wanted to turn around, to leave, and pretend none of this was happening. But the universe had already decided that tonight was the night he learned the truth. With a deep breath, he pushed the door open. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of wine and perfume. And there, tangled in the sheets, was Maya, her bare back exposed, her arms wrapped around another man. Not just any man, Alex. The moment stretched into eternity. Maya turned her head, and when her eyes met his, everything changed. Shock, panic, guilt, they all flickered across her face in rapid succession. She pulled the sheets up to her chest, as if they could shield her from what she had done. Rick, but there were no words that could fix this. Rick didn't speak. He couldn't. His breath felt trapped in his lungs, his stomach twisting into knots so tight they threatened to suffocate him. He had imagined many futures with Maya. Marriage, children, a home filled with love. But in that moment, every one of those dreams shattered into dust. Alex, smug and unapologetic, leaned back against the pillows, stretching lazily. Well, this is awkward. Rick saw red. It took every ounce of self-control not to launch across the room and break Alex's nose. He clenched his fists so hard his knuckles turned white. Maya scrambled out of bed, grabbing for a dress. Rick, it's not what it looks like. A bitter laugh escaped him. Not what it looks like. Really? Then tell me, Maya, what exactly is this? A business meeting? His voice dripped with venom. Tears welled up in her eyes, but he no longer cared. How many times had she cried to him about trust? About commitment? How many times had she looked him in the eyes and sworn she loved him? Andrea appeared at the doorway, arms crossed. You gonna keep lying, Maya, or should I tell him everything? Maya's face twisted in fury. You set me up. Andrea scoffed. No, you set yourself up. Rick exhaled sharply. He had heard enough. He turned on his heel and walked away. He didn't care what excuses Maya would come up with, what lies she would spin. The truth was laid bare before him, raw and undeniable. He had loved her, and she had destroyed him. As he stepped out into the cool night air, he knew one thing for certain. This wedding was never going to happen. It was over. Rick didn't speak. He couldn't. His mind was a battlefield, emotions colliding in a violent storm. Rage, sorrow, disbelief. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, but there was no fight left in him. Only a deep, hollow ache where his heart used to be. Maya's voice cut through the shock like a dull blade. Rick, this isn't what it looks like. Her breathless, desperate lie was almost laughable. She was half-dressed, tangled in sheets that weren't theirs, beside a man she once claimed was nothing more than a closed chapter. The ex-boyfriend she had sworn to be over. The same man she had mocked for being immature and toxic. And yet, here she was, wrapped up in him like he was home. Andrea stood beside Rick, arms crossed, her face a mixture of fury and vindication. Don't even try that bullshit, Maya. He deserves the truth. The truth. Rick had believed their love was strong, that their years together meant something. He had sacrificed for her, supported her, dreamed of a future together. And yet, in the final days before their wedding, the supposed happiest moment of their lives, she had chosen to betray him. Not in a moment of weakness, but with intention, with deception. Maya stumbled out of bed, clutching a sheet to her chest, panic flashing in her eyes. Rick, please. I was drunk. I made a mistake. He scoffed, shaking his head. A mistake. His voice was quiet, eerily calm. A mistake is forgetting to turn off the stove. A mistake is sending a text to the wrong person. What you did, he exhaled sharply, fighting to keep his composure. What you did wasn't a mistake, Maya. It was a choice. The ex, who had been silent until now, ran a hand through his disheveled hair. looking anywhere but at Rick. Look, man, I didn't know she was still with you. She, she told me things were complicated. Rick turned to him, his jaw tightening. He could feel the anger bubbling beneath the surface, hot and suffocating. But he wouldn't explode. He refused to give them the satisfaction. Maya's lips trembled. She stepped forward, reaching for his hand, but he recoiled as if her touch might burn him. Please, Rick, we could talk about this. Talk. What was there to say? That she had been lying to him for who knows how long? That the love he thought they shared had been nothing more than a mirage? That everything, the late-night talks, the dreams, the wedding planning, had all been leading up to this moment? He looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, he didn't see the woman he loved. He saw a stranger, someone capable of smiling in his face while keeping secrets in the dark, someone who had taken his love, his trust, and shattered them without hesitation. Rick inhaled deeply, his chest rising and falling as he made his decision. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out. Maya screamed after him, Rick, wait, don't do this, please. Her voice cracked, but he didn't turn back. Not this time. Andrea followed him into the hallway. Rick, but he held up a hand, stopping her. Not now, Andrea. His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. Not now. She nodded, stepping aside as he strode past her. The world outside the hotel was a blur of neon lights and distant laughter, but all Rick could hear was the deafening silence in his chest. He had always imagined his wedding day as the happiest moment of his life. Instead, he was leaving behind a woman who had never truly been his, realizing that love, real love, should never feel this way. And for the first time in years, despite the pain, despite the betrayal, Rick felt free. The morning of the wedding arrived like an eerie calm before a storm. The sun cast golden rays through the blinds of Rick's apartment, painting the walls in warm hues that betrayed the cold emptiness he felt inside. The world outside buzzed with life. Cars honked, birds chirped, people laughed. But inside, Rick sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the tuxedo hanging by the door. The same tuxedo he had once been excited to wear, believing it marked the beginning of his forever. His phone had been vibrating nonstop. Messages flooded in. Friends, family, even Maya's mother. Where are you? Is everything okay? The guests are arriving. But not a single message from Maya. Rick exhaled sharply and stood, running a hand through his disheveled hair. He was exhausted. He hadn't slept. His mind had spent the night replaying the scene over and over. Maya's stunned face as he caught her with her ex, the hurried whispers, the way she had scrambled to cover herself, as if that would erase what he had seen. A sharp knock at his door made him flinch. For a brief second, he considered ignoring it. But then came a voice, soft, pleading. Rick, are you in there? Maya. A slow, bitter smile formed on his lips. Of course, she's here now. Rick walked to the door, but he didn't open it. Instead, he leaned against it, gripping the handle like it was the only thing tethering him to reality. I know you're in there, Maya continued, her voice laced with forced calmness. We need to talk. Please. Rick took a deep breath, counted to 3, then opened the door. Maya stood before him in her wedding dress, a vision in white. The dress hugged her curves perfectly, the delicate lace sleeves draped over her arms like something out of a dream. Her makeup was flawless, her dark eyes wide with desperation. To anyone else, she looked like a radiant bride ready to walk down the aisle. To Rick, she looked like a ghost of everything he had lost. She stepped forward, reaching for him, but he took a step back. What are you doing here, Maya? His voice was cold, foreign even to himself. Maya's smile wavered, but she quickly recovered. It's our wedding day. I don't know what happened last night, but we can fix this. Rick laughed, a hollow, humorless sound. You don't know what happened? He scoffed, shaking his head. You were with him, Maya. Do you even remember that? Or did you think I'd just forget? Maya's eyes flickered with something, guilt, maybe, but not enough. It wasn't what it looked like, she said quickly, grabbing his hand. I was drunk. I was emotional. You know how I get when I drink, Rick. I didn't mean for it to happen. Rick yanked his hand away as if her touch burned. You didn't mean for it to happen? His voice rose now, anger clawing its way out. You don't just accidentally end up in bed with your ex the night before your wedding, Maya. Tears welled in her eyes, but Rick wasn't falling for it this time. He had seen her cry before, seen how she used those tears to twist situations in her favor. This wasn't heartbreak. It was damage control. I love you, she whispered. I love us. Don't throw that away over one mistake. Rick clenched his jaw. His heart ached. God, it ached, but love wasn't enough. Love shouldn't have led him to this moment. Standing in his apartment on the morning of his wedding, questioning everything he had ever believed about the woman in front of him. He took a deep breath. When he spoke, his voice was steady. Final. There's not going to be a wedding. Maya's face crumbled. Rick, no. Please, don't do this. It's already done. He turned away, stepping deeper into the apartment, away from her. Go home, Maya. A moment of silence, and then the mask slipped. Her soft cries turned into something sharper, something bitter. You're really going to humiliate me like this? She spat. In front of everyone? The guests, my family, our friends? You're really just going to walk away? Rick turned back to her, meeting her glare with an icy stare of his own. No, Maya. You humiliated me the moment you betrayed me. Maya's nostrils flared, but for the first time, she had no argument, no excuse, no clever manipulation, just silence. And that was all Rick needed. He turned, walked to the tuxedo by the door, and pulled it down. Not to wear it, just to throw it away. Behind him, Maya let out a frustrated sob, then stormed out. The door slammed shut. And for the first time in a long time, Rick felt free. Rick sat on his apartment balcony, the cold breeze biting at his skin. It had been a week since the almost wedding, a week since he had walked away from Maya's deceit. Yet, the sting of betrayal still clung to him like a wound refusing to heal. The city buzzed below, indifferent to his pain, and for the first time in years, he felt truly alone. His phone vibrated on the glass table beside him. Another message from Maya. He let it sit there, unread, just like the dozen others before it. Apologies, excuses, empty words wrapped in desperation. He had seen it all before. The way people scramble to save themselves when they realize they've lost control. But she hadn't lost control. She had thrown it away, just like she had thrown away their love. A sharp knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. He hesitated, his heart pounding with an old, familiar fear. What if it was her? What if she had come in person, pushing for one last chance to manipulate him? Another knock, firmer this time. Rick exhaled slowly and walked to the door. He opened it to find Andrea standing there, hands in the pockets of her leather jacket, her expression softer than he had ever seen. She wasn't wearing her usual cocky smirk or throwing out some sarcastic remark. Instead, she just looked tired. Can I come in? She asked quietly. Rick stepped aside, allowing her in. She walked past him, her eyes flickering over the half-packed suitcases, the wedding gifts still in their untouched boxes. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. So, you're leaving? She asked, nodding toward the luggage. Rick ran a hand through his hair. Thinking about it, he admitted, I just don't know where to go yet. Andrea sat on the arm of his couch, tapping her fingers against her knee. I should have told you earlier, she said after a long silence. I wanted to. I almost did, so many times. But every time I tried, I thought, what if he doesn't believe me? What if he thinks I'm just trying to mess things up between them? Rick leaned against the wall, arms crossed. I probably wouldn't have believed you, he admitted. I was so blinded. Andrea nodded, her expression unreadable. She doesn't love anyone, you know. Not really. Maya loves attention. She loves being adored, being spoiled. But real love? Love that requires work, sacrifice, commitment? She doesn't know how to do that. Rick clenched his jaw. Deep down, he had always sensed it, but he had ignored the signs, convincing himself that love meant overlooking flaws. But love wasn't supposed to be one-sided. It wasn't supposed to feel like carrying the weight of an entire relationship alone. Andrea sighed, pulling out her phone. She's already moved on, by the way. Rick blinked. What? Without a word, Andrea turned the screen toward him. It was a picture, Maya, sitting in a dimly lit restaurant, laughing with a man Rick didn't recognize. Her hand was resting on his, the same way she used to hold Rick's. His stomach twisted, but not with heartbreak. It was something else this time, clarity. Andrea watched his reaction carefully. I didn't show you this to hurt you, she said. I wanted you to see her for who she really is. No more illusions. No more lies. Rick exhaled slowly, feeling something inside him loosen, like a chain that had been wrapped around his chest for too long. He had spent the last week drowning in memories, in pain, in all the what-ifs. But this moment? This was the closure he hadn't realized he needed. She did me a favor, he murmured. Andrea arched an eyebrow. Come again. Rick looked up at her, and for the first time in days, a ghost of a smile played on his lips. If I had married her, I would have spent the rest of my life wondering if she was faithful. I would have given her everything, and she would have taken more. She saved me from that. He let out a small, bitter chuckle. So, yeah, she did me a favor. Andrea studied him for a long moment before shaking her head with a grin. You're tougher than I thought, Rick. He smirked. You didn't think I was tough? I thought you were a good guy, she said, standing up. And good guys usually let people walk all over them. Rick met her gaze, something shifting in the air between them. Not anymore. Andrea smiled, nodding approvingly. Good. She turned toward the door, but hesitated. You know, there's a whole world out there, past this city. Maybe you should go see it. Rick glanced at the suitcases, then back at her. Maybe she was right. Maybe this wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. Maybe I will, he said. Andrea winked. Good. Just don't let another Maya happen to you. As the door shut behind her, Rick took one last look at his phone, at the unopened messages from Maya. With a deep breath, he deleted them all. For the first time in years, he felt free, betrayed and broken. But he came back stronger. The ultimate revenge story. Tim Miran stood on his back porch, sipping his coffee as the first rays of sunlight stretched over the horizon. The world was quiet, save for the rhythmic chirping of birds and the distant hum of a neighbor's lawnmower. It was a simple, peaceful moment, the kind he lived for. From where he stood, Tim could see the backyard swing set, the plastic slide glistening with dew. Just yesterday, he had pushed his daughter, Emily, on the swing, her laughter ringing through the cool evening air. His son, Jake, had been sprawled on the grass, lost in a world of action figures and grand battles only he could see. It was moments like these that made everything worth it. The long hours at work, the stress, the sacrifices, it all meant something because at the end of the day, he had them. He had this. And he had Becky. Tim smiled at the thought of his wife. They had been together for nearly a decade now, their love weathering the highs and lows of marriage. She was beautiful, even more so than the day he met her. That sun-kissed blonde hair, those piercing blue eyes. She was the kind of woman who turned heads effortlessly. But more than that, she was sharp, ambitious, and charming in a way that made people hang on to her every word. She was also the daughter of Ronald Maines, the wealthiest and most powerful man in town. That had been a challenge at first. Ronald never saw Tim as worthy of his daughter, an IT consultant with big dreams, but no old money to back them up. Still, Tim worked hard, building his business from the ground up. Over the years, he proved himself, earning the town's respect and, eventually, Ronald's reluctant approval. Now, they lived in a beautiful home, had 2 wonderful children, and a life most people envied. The American dream, wrapped up in a neat little bow. At least, that's what he thought. That morning, Becky had already left for work before he woke up. Lately, that had been happening more and more. Late nights, early mornings, her schedule had become erratic, her excuses vague. Big project at the bank. New clients in town. Long meetings. Tim had never been the jealous type. He trusted Becky, or at least he had always thought he did. But something fell off. The past few months had been different. The spark between them had dulled. She barely looked at him the way she used to. Conversations felt forced. When he kissed her, she pulled away just a little too soon. He had tried to ignore it. Marriage had rough patches. That's what people always said, right? Maybe they were just in one of those phases. He told himself that once things calmed down at work, they'd find their way back to each other. But deep down, a small, gnawing feeling whispered that something was wrong. That evening, Becky came home late again. The kids were already asleep, and Tim was on the couch, flipping through channels absent-mindedly. When he heard the front door creak open, he glanced at the clock, 10:47 p.m. She stepped inside, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. Her makeup was still perfect, her perfume lingering in the air, expensive, floral, and not the one she usually wore. "Hey," Tim said, keeping his voice light. "Hey," Becky responded, barely sparing him a glance as she tossed her purse onto the entryway table. She walked straight to the kitchen, grabbing a glass and filling it with water. Tim watched her carefully. He had memorized every little detail about her over the years. The way she bit her lip when she was nervous, the way she twirled her hair when she was thinking. And right now, something was off. "You worked late again?" he asked. "Yeah." She didn't turn around. "For the third time this week." She hesitated for just a second, a blinking you'll miss it moment. But Tim caught it. "It's been crazy," she said, finally facing him. "You know how it is." He nodded slowly, but something in his gut twisted. He didn't know how it was. But that wasn't the problem. The problem was her. The problem was the distance in her eyes. The problem was the way she had started treating him like furniture, something that was just there, unnoticed, unimportant. "I was thinking," he started, keeping his voice casual, "maybe we should take a weekend trip. Just us. Get away for a bit." Becky sighed, rubbing her temples. "Tim, I really don't have time for that right now." "You don't have time for us?" Her eyes flicked up to meet his, and for the first time in months, he saw it. An emotion she couldn't quite mask. Not guilt, not sadness. Annoyance. Tim felt like the air had been knocked out of him. "Look," she said, forcing a small smile. "Things will slow down soon. Let's talk about it later, okay?" He nodded, but his chest felt tight. Something was very, very wrong. That night, as Becky slept beside him, Tim lay awake staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet, too quiet. A storm was coming. He could feel it in his bones. And he wasn't ready. But he would be. Because whatever this was, whatever Becky was hiding, he was going to find out. And when he did, nothing would ever be the same. Tim Miran woke to the soft glow of morning seeping through the bedroom blinds. His muscles ached pleasantly from the night before, one of the rare, passionate nights he and Becky had shared months. He smiled as he stretched, his fingers grazing the empty space beside him. Becky was already up. Maybe, just maybe, things were turning around. For weeks, he had felt the distance growing between them. The late nights, the hushed phone calls, the sudden coldness in her touch. But last night had felt different. It was like they had reconnected, if only for a moment. Tim sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. That was when he saw her. Becky stood at the foot of the bed, arms crossed, a crisp white envelope in her manicured hands. She wasn't dressed for work yet. No makeup, hair still a tangled mess from sleep. But her expression was unreadable, cold, detached, as if the woman he had kissed just hours ago was a stranger. His heart clenched. Something was wrong. "What's that?" he asked, his voice thick with sleep. Becky sighed, almost lazily, and tossed the envelope onto the bed. "It's over, dumbass." For a moment, the words didn't register. They didn't belong in his world. Over? What did she mean over? "What?" "Read it," she said, cutting him off. Tim's fingers trembled as he reached for the envelope and tore it open. His eyes scanned the first few lines. His breath caught in his throat. Divorce petition. It felt like the room shrank around him. This has to be a mistake," he stammered, flipping through the pages. The demands were absurd. She wanted everything: the house, full custody of the kids, control over their joint assets. Worse, She had already drained their savings. Tim looked up at her, searching for some sign that this was a cruel joke. That any second now, she'd smirk and say, "Gotcha," but there was no trace of amusement in her eyes. "You can't be serious," he whispered. "I've never been more serious in my life," Becky said, rolling her shoulders as if shaking off a burden. "I should have done this months ago, honestly." Tim swung his legs over the side of the bed, his pulse hammering in his ears. "Why? Becky, I don't understand. Last night was a goodbye gift." The way she said it, so casual, so heartless, sent a spike of nausea through him. His mind raced, searching for something, anything that made sense. Had she fallen out of love? Was she unhappy? Had he done something wrong? And then it hit him. His jaw tightened. "There's someone else, isn't there?" Becky smirked, the kind of smirk that made his stomach turn. She didn't even try to deny it. "I'm moving in with Josh." Josh Carter. The name sent a bolt of fury straight through him. He hadn't heard that name in years. Becky's high school sweetheart, the one she used to gush about in stories of her teenage years. The golden boy who had left town for some big job in the city. Tim clenched his fists. "You've been cheating on me?" "Please," Becky scoffed. "Spare me the drama. It's been over between us for a long time, Tim. You just refuse to see it." His hand shook as he gripped the divorce papers. "And you expect me to just roll over and let you take my kids? My business? My life?" She tilted her head, as if considering it. "Yeah, pretty much." Tim felt something inside him snap. "I won't let you do this," he growled. Becky sighed, shaking her head in mock pity. "You don't have a choice, Tim. My father's already pulling the strings. The judge will be in our pocket. The lawyers? Bought and paid for. You'll be lucky if you get weekend visits with the kids." His stomach twisted. Ronald Maines. Of course. Her father had never approved of him, the small-town tech guy who wasn't worthy of his princess. And now, the banker with more influence than half the town was finally making his move. Becky leaned in, her voice dripping with condescension. "Honestly, you should be grateful I let you have one last night. Josh wanted me to end things sooner, but I figured I'd throw you a bone." She smirked. "Consider it charity." Tim's vision blurred with rage. Becky grabbed her phone from the dresser and checked the time. "You have 48 hours to pack your shit and get out." And just like that, she turned and walked out, leaving him alone in the ruins of his perfect life. Tim sat there, staring at the divorce papers in his shaking hands. The walls around him, the bed he had shared with her, the life they had built together, it all felt like a cruel illusion. But as the shock faded, something else took its place. A slow, seething fire. They thought he would roll over. They thought he would break. They were wrong. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Tim sat in the empty living room, the air thick with silence. The house he once called home now felt like a stranger's, stripped of warmth, stripped of meaning. Boxes stacked against the wall held what little Becky allowed him to take. Some clothes, a few books, his laptop. Everything else? Hers. The couch where he once cuddled with his kids. The framed pictures of their life together. Even the damn toaster. Gone. The divorce papers sat on the coffee table, taunting him. Becky's signature, crisp and confident, finalized her betrayal in ink. A car honked outside. His friend Dave, one of the few willing to help, leaned out the window of an old pickup. "You ready?" Tim swallowed hard. Ready? No. But what choice did he have? He took one last look around. The ghost of laughter still clung to the walls, echoes of bedtime stories and whispered "I love yous." Then, with a deep breath, he picked up the last box and walked out the door. Becky stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching like a queen observing a peasant's departure. Behind her, Josh lounged against the doorframe, smirking. "Don't forget to lock up," Becky called out. "Wouldn't want to inconvenience the new owners." Tim froze. "New owners?" "Oh," Becky said with mock innocence. "Didn't I mention? Dad put in an offer. Should close in a few weeks." She was selling their home, their children's home. Tim clenched his jaw, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. He turned, tossed the last box into the truck bed, and climbed into the passenger seat. As Dave pulled away, he kept his eyes on the road, refusing to look back. Tim's new home wasn't a home at all. The second-floor office above his IT shop smelled of stale coffee and old circuit boards. A desk, a rolling chair, and a worn-out futon in the corner, his new bedroom. The only window overlooked Main Street, where families strolled past, oblivious to the man whose world had just collapsed. Dropping onto the futon, he ran a hand through his hair. The ache in his chest wasn't just sadness. It was rage, a slow-burning ember waiting for air. How had he been so blind, so trusting? His phone buzzed. A text from Becky. "Becky, we'll pick up the kids Saturday. Don't be late. And please don't make this harder than it needs to be." Harder? She had ripped his life apart, and she wanted him to make it easy? Tim stared at the screen, his fingers curling into fists. Then he did something he never thought he would. He opened his laptop, cracked his knuckles, and started digging. First step, access Becky's email. She was careless, always using the same weak passwords. It took less than 5 minutes to slip past her security. Second step, find the truth. What he uncovered made his blood run cold. Months of emails with Josh. Not just love letters, but planning, talks of how they would phase Tim out, how they would handle the kids. And then the real bombshell, emails between Becky and her father. Money transfers, quiet, off-the-books loans. Something shady was going on at Maine's Federal Bank, something big. Tim leaned back, heart pounding. They thought he was beaten. They thought he'd just disappear. They had no idea what was coming. Tim sat in the darkened office, his old leather chair creaking beneath him. The glow of his computer screen was the only light in the room, casting sharp shadows against the walls. A half-empty bottle of whiskey sat next to his keyboard, untouched. He wasn't drinking tonight. His mind was too sharp, too focused for that. He leaned forward, fingers gliding over the keyboard, pulling up every digital trace Becky and Josh had ever left behind. He had spent years building his IT business, learning every trick in the book, penetration testing, forensic analysis, network surveillance. The same skills that had helped protect businesses from hackers were now fueling his revenge. And Becky, for all her cunning, had been sloppy. The first crack in her armor appeared almost instantly. A shared cloud account, a forgotten backup folder. Tim's breath hitched as the screen filled with text messages, emails, and voicemails. The past 6 months of his life were spelled out in digital ink, each line a dagger to the gut. Becky, God, I wish I didn't have to pretend with him anymore. Josh, almost there, babe. Just hold on. The divorce should wipe him out. Becky, I know. And once we have the kids, he'll have no reason to be in my life at all. Tim clenched his fists so hard his knuckles cracked. Every doubt, every moment he had second-guessed himself had been justified. But then, he found something even better. Bank statements, transactions, large sums of money flowing between Becky, her father's bank, and a series of shell companies. Ronald Maines, the so-called pillar of the community, had been funneling money in ways that no bank should. And Becky was in deep, managing accounts, signing paperwork, laundering money under the guise of investment portfolios. This wasn't just fraud. It was the kind of crime that put people in prison for decades. Tim leaned back, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. He wasn't just going to fight back. He was going to burn them to the ground. The legal counterattack. At dawn, Tim made his move. He slid into a booth at an all-night diner, across from an old friend, Jeremy Harlow, an attorney he hadn't spoken to in years. Jeremy sipped his black coffee, his suit wrinkled, but his eyes sharp. "You're telling me," Jeremy said, flipping through the printed-out emails and account statements, "that your ex-wife and her father are committing bank fraud, and you have proof?" Tim nodded. Jeremy let out a low whistle. "Jesus, Tim, this isn't just a divorce case. This is a goddamn bomb." Tim drummed his fingers against the table. "Can we use it?" "Oh, we can use it." Jeremy grinned, his lawyer instincts kicking in. First, we countersue fraud, financial misconduct, hidden assets. We hit her in court before she knows what's happening. He tapped the table. And your business? I'll make sure she doesn't get a cent. Tim exhaled slowly. Good, but I'm not stopping there. Jeremy raised an eyebrow. There's more. Tim slid another folder across the table. That's for the federal regulators. Jeremy opened it. His eyes widened. Holy shit. Tim's voice was calm, deadly. By the time they realize what's happening, it'll be too late. The first blow lands. 2 days later, Becky walked into court expecting an easy win. Dressed in a sleek black dress, her makeup flawless, she smirked at Tim from across the room, the confidence of someone who believed she had already won. That smirk disappeared the moment Jeremy handed the judge the stack of documents. Your Honor, he said, voice smooth as silk, we have reason to believe the plaintiff has engaged in financial misconduct, hidden assets, and fraud. Becky's face went pale. The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes, flipped through the evidence. Her frown deepened. This is serious. I'll need time to review. She set the papers down. Until then, all asset transfers are frozen. That includes the plaintiff's accounts. Tim didn't smile. Not yet. But inside, he felt the first stirrings of satisfaction. The war had just begun, and he was winning. Tim stood by the window of his small office, sipping a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Below, Main Street bustled as it did every morning. Parents dropping kids off at school, business owners flipping their open signs, retirees settling into their favorite cafe corners. A picturesque, small-town morning. But today, something was different. Today, the first domino would fall. His phone buzzed. A message from his lawyer, Sean. Check the news. It's happening. Tim sat down, opened his laptop, and refreshed the local news site. Breaking. Federal investigators raid Maine's federal bank. His lips curled into a grin as he read. The article detailed how federal regulators had arrived at Ronald Maine's bank first thing in the morning, armed with warrants and forensic accountants. They were reviewing records, freezing questionable accounts, and combing through years of financial transactions. Ronald had spent decades building his empire, weaving his influence into the fabric of the town. But even the mightiest towers crumble when the foundation is built on fraud. Tim knew Ronald would be in full panic mode, likely barking orders at his staff, making frantic calls to his contacts in law enforcement and politics. Anyone who could pull strings. But this was federal. No favors. No bribes. No escape. And this was only the beginning. The fallout begins. Tim stepped outside and walked across the street to McGavin's Diner, the town's unofficial gossip hub. Inside, the usual morning crowd sat hunched over newspapers and steaming cups of coffee. But something was different. The usual hum of conversation had an electric charge to it. They shut down the whole bank, one man muttered. Heard they're looking at fraud charges, another whispered. Tim slid onto a bar stool. The waitress, Sandy, raised an eyebrow as she poured him a cup of coffee. Hell of a morning, huh? Seems like it, Tim said casually, stirring his coffee as if he wasn't the one pulling the strings behind the scenes. Just then, the diner door swung open hard enough to make the bell jangle violently. In stomped Becky, her face flushed red with fury. She spotted Tim instantly and stormed toward him. What the hell did you do? Tim took a slow sip of coffee. Good morning to you too. You think this is funny? She hissed, leaning in so only he could hear. You're behind this. I know you are. Tim shrugged. You think I control federal investigations? That's given me a lot of credit. Becky's nostrils flared. You're not going to win. Tim set his cup down and met her eyes with a calm, deadly seriousness. Becky, I already have. She recoiled slightly, but before she could respond, a commotion erupted from outside. Through the diner window, they saw Ronald Maines himself storming down the sidewalk, his expensive suit rumpled, his face a mask of fury. People stepped out of his way as he entered the bank, disappearing behind the locked glass doors. Tim turned back to Becky. Looks like Daddy has his hands full. Her face twisted with rage, but before she could fire back, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, then paled. Without another word, she turned and rushed out the door. Tim leaned back, watching her retreating form. The walls were closing in on them, and he was just getting started. The legal strike. By the time Tim arrived at the courthouse that afternoon, his lawyer was already there, waiting with a confident smirk. "It's like clockwork," Sean said, handing him a folder. Inside were emergency court filings, blocking Becky from taking further financial action, contesting the divorce terms, and securing a new custody hearing based on new evidence of her misconduct. The emails, the financial discrepancies, the affair. Becky was about to face a very different legal battle. By the time the judge reviewed the evidence, Becky's carefully curated narrative, devoted mother, betrayed wife, had crumbled into dust. The judge wasn't impressed. "You've made a mockery of these proceedings," he told her. And just like that, Tim was granted temporary full custody of the kids. When the ruling was read, Becky collapsed into her chair, shaking her head in disbelief. Ronald hadn't shown up to support her. Josh was nowhere to be seen. For the first time in a long time, Becky Maines was alone. And Tim? He walked out of that courtroom with his head held high. The reckoning had only just begun. Tim sat in the back of the courtroom, his fingers steepled as he watched Becky take the witness stand. The once flawless woman he had married now looked worn, her designer suit wrinkled, dark circles forming under her eyes from sleepless nights. The stress was breaking her. "Good." His lawyer, Daniel Roth, stood and adjusted his tie. A practiced smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth as he stepped toward the stand. "Mrs. Miron, you claim to be the more stable parent, correct?" Becky shifted uncomfortably. "Yes, I." Daniel held up a stack of papers. "Then how do you explain these?" He handed a copy to the judge and another to Becky's lawyer. "Text messages, bank statements, and hotel receipts, all proving your long-term affair with Joshua Wexler. Would you like to read them aloud for the court, or should I?" The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. Becky's throat bobbed as she swallowed hard. Her lawyer, Richard Calloway, stood abruptly. "Objection. These are personal matters unrelated to custody." The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s, raised an eyebrow. "Overruled. Infidelity may not determine custody, but it speaks to character. Proceed, Mr. Roth." Daniel nodded, turning back to Becky. "You lied to your husband. You deceived your children. And now you want the court to believe you deserve full custody." Becky's composure cracked. Tim was distant. He was always working. I was lonely." Tim let out a small chuckle, just loud enough for her to hear. Becky shot him a glare, but there was something else in her eyes now, fear. Daniel tilted his head. "Lonely? Is that what led you to siphon over $80,000 from your joint savings account in the last 6 months? Because that money certainly wasn't spent on the children." Becky paled. The judge flipped through the financial records Daniel had submitted. "Mrs. Miron, where did these funds go?" Becky's lawyer whispered furiously in her ear, but she couldn't speak. She had no excuse. Tim leaned back, enjoying the sight. One by one, Becky's lies were dismantled. When the court adjourned for lunch, Becky stormed out. Tim followed at a leisurely pace, stepping into the courthouse lobby just in time to see Ronald, Maines pacing near the entrance, his face red with fury. "You arrogant little bastard," Ronald spat as Tim approached. "You think you've won?" Tim smiled, slipping his hands into his pockets. "I don't think, Ronald. I know." Ronald clenched his fists. "You have no idea what I'm capable of." Tim leaned in, voice low. "And you have no idea what's about to happen to you." Just then, a voice called out, "Mr. Maines?" Ronald turned, and 3 men in dark suits stepped forward. Agents Michael Carter and James Dolan, Federal Financial Crimes Division. "We have a warrant for your arrest." The blood drained from Ronald's face. Tim watched, satisfied, as the agents presented a thick folder of documents, evidence of years of fraudulent banking activity. He had spent weeks compiling everything and sending it to the right people. Now it was finally playing out. Ronald spluttered. "This is a mistake. The agents weren't listening." One of them pulled out handcuffs. "Ronald Maines, you're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and financial misconduct." Click. The cuffs locked around his wrists. Becky reappeared just in time to witness her father being led away in disgrace. She gasped, hand flying her mouth. "Dad? What?" Ronald turned, eyes burning with betrayal. "This is your fault, you stupid girl." Tim stifled a laugh. The family empire was crumbling. By the time the afternoon hearing resumed, Becky's spirit had been shattered. When the judge ruled in Tim's favor, granting him full custody and denying Becky spousal support, she barely reacted. Tim, on the other hand, smiled for the first time in weeks. Walking out of the courthouse, he inhaled the crisp autumn air. He had won. And the best part? This was only the beginning. Tim Moran stood on the balcony of his office, his home, for the past 6 months, watching the sunrise spill molten gold over the town. It was the same town that had turned its back on him, whispered about his downfall, and laughed behind closed doors as Becky paraded her betrayal in broad daylight. Now, those same people whispered a different story. They spoke of how Tim had outmaneuvered the Maines family, how he had brought down a corrupt empire with nothing but his intelligence and patience. He sipped his coffee, letting the bitter taste ground him in the present. The war was over, and he had won. Becky's fall. It had been a spectacle, watching Becky unravel. When the court ruled in his favor, granting him full custody of the kids, Becky had erupted in the courtroom. She screamed at the judge, at Tim, at her own lawyer, demanding that this wasn't fair. "Fair," Tim had said, his voice level but cold. "Like how it was fair when you stole from me, when you tried to erase me from my own children's lives." The judge had banged the gavel, silencing her, and the finality of her loss set in. Then came the financial collapse. With Ronald Maines forced to step down from his bank and legal cases piling up against him, Becky's golden safety net vanished. She had no job. Her father had always provided for her. Josh had disappeared like a rat abandoning a sinking ship. She had lost everything in a matter of months. And the town? The town did what it always did, it turned. Becky became a cautionary tale, her once admiring friends now avoiding her, as if betrayal were contagious. Tim had seen her a few times since the ruling. She had tried to play the victim, showing up at his office with tear-streaked cheeks. "I made mistakes, Tim," she had whispered, reaching for his hand. "But we were good once, weren't we? Maybe we can." No, that single word had frozen her, and for the first time, he saw true fear in her eyes. Not fear of him, but fear of the abyss she had created for herself. Ronald Maines, the end of a dynasty. Tim had expected the bank to fold, but not this fast. The federal investigations uncovered a web of fraud so deep that Ronald Maines didn't just lose his job. He lost everything. The state pressed charges. His assets were frozen. He went from a king to a prisoner in the blink of an eye. The last time Tim had seen Ronald was on the news, being led out of his estate in handcuffs, his face grim, eyes hollow. At that moment, Tim knew the war was truly over. A new beginning. Life moved on. His business, once on the brink of collapse, now thrived. The public respect he had lost in the scandal returned tenfold. Clients who had abandoned him came crawling back, eager to align themselves with the man who had taken down the town's most powerful family. But none of it compared to the real victory, his children. He watched them play in the park, their laughter filling the crisp autumn air. For months, he had worried about how the divorce and the chaos would affect them. But now, they seemed lighter, free from the tension and manipulation Becky had sown into their lives. His daughter, Maddie, ran up to him and tugged his hand. "Dad, can we get ice cream?" He smiled, crouching to meet her gaze. "You know what? Look at the biggest sundaes they have." Her eyes lit up, and she threw her arms around his neck. "You're the best." As he lifted her into his arms, he saw Becky in the distance, sitting on a park bench alone, watching them. She looked smaller now, like a shadow of the woman she once was. She had nothing left to say. Tim turned away. She had made her choices, and now so had he. As he walked with the children toward the ice cream shop, he breathed in the cool evening air, feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. And for the first time in a long time, he smiled. Not the victorious smirk of a man who had won a war, but the quiet, contented smile of a father, a survivor, a man finally free.